Okay, everybody, we're in week 14, and this is the week we're going to have our team meetings. And you guys are going to impress the heck out of me with all of your great design work and your budget work and show me how you can design on the fly and do all that within an hour. So I thought that maybe it would be a good idea for us to do a quick recap. I would strongly suggest you have this recap printed out and with you during our meeting because it's got some quick notes in there that might jog your memory on stuff. It doesn't have a lot of detail, obviously, because I'm going to go through pretty much the whole course in about 15 slides here, hopefully in about 30 minutes. But it will give you the hints, if you will, some keywords, some things that will make you say, "Oh yeah, that's where he's going." So if you want to print it out and have it ready, I think that's to your advantage. That is obviously up to you. So it might be hard to remember where we started in this course. We've spent the second half of the course strictly on electronic systems, and the reason that I do that, as I have said before, is that many new security graduates, especially in the corporate side and in the homeland side, really only have an overview of electronic systems, and it's a nuts and bolts thing. When you get to your first job, one of the first things your boss, if they are a security professional with any kind of tenure, is going to say, okay, you're the administrator for all these systems because it's tedious and there's a lot of work to it. I think it's fun, quite frankly, and so I do it, from a global standpoint. Actually, I'm the administrator for our systems globally, although I don't hardly ever touch the systems themselves. It's more business decisions at that level. But I think it's fun, especially when you're just starting out and you can kind of learn on the fly. But having somebody teach you is the whole problem there. When somebody hands something off, they most of the time want to run away from it. So having some general idea of how these systems work was I think a time well spent for those of you who will go into industry and into homeland security. But we started off talking about planning. Excuse me. Talking about how a site security plan is a way that we lay things out. We talked about procedures, and we did some procedures and policies. We talked barriers and lights. Remember bollards and lights and things? You took some pictures for me. We talked a lot about locks because it's something that security people don't have a lot of knowledge on usually, and it's one of the first things you've got to determine for interior security and exterior and perimeter security. We talked about access control systems, intrusion detection systems, video systems. We talked a little bit about biodigital devices just as a wave of the future and as a warning about privacy. Then we went to budgets and we realized that this stuff is not cheap. And then you had your peer reviews last week and prepared for our presentations. So if you remember correctly, we started talking about site security plans, and it's a written reference that matches the risks, the threats, and the vulnerabilities to your mitigations. Remember, we looked at risks, we looked at threats, and from there we said, okay, what doesn't match, right? You're protecting something very valuable. You've got high-level threats that want to get to that valuable thing. Where are your vulnerabilities? What do you need to do? Do you need to lock the doors? Do you need to have video surveillance so you could triage if somebody tried to attack or compromise your resource? And you're matching those to physical security mitigations. Remember that word. We talked a little bit about convenience, and the book was, as many of our textbooks and experts are, extremely adverse to any type of convenience in security. I am not of that camp. I hope that I convince you at least to consider that if you take responsible risks, you're going to increase your security posture, not decrease it. If you, people will block doors open if you make it too hard for them to get in a door every time they need to get to it. So if you have something you're trying to protect that's of medium risk, and you put on a biometric device and a card reader and a thumbprint reader and a retina scanner, and then you need to go through a full body scan of some kind, and you have to present two people in order to get in there, it's not going to take long before somebody takes a piece of duct tape and puts it across the door bolt, or takes a rubber door stop or something heavy and just lets that door sit open. And certainly you would have it alarmed. You would get an alarm from that door, and someone would go and close it. But after a while, the guards get tired of doing it. Somebody shuts that alarm off, assuming that it's just coming in all the time because it's malfunctioning, and you have a priority resource with a door stop and a taped door bolt. So, making it somewhat convenient for people to get in is something that you need to balance so that people don't compromise your security as you're trying to increase it. We talked a little bit about crime prevention through environmental design. That is an entire course or two in and of itself. It's a way to design a new or renovated facility with security in mind. If you can design the roadway leading into your facility, why not make it with a few twists and turns so somebody couldn't get up ahead of steam to run a vehicle into your building? If you can design the landscape, why not a row of heavy trees somewhere where you might want to block a vehicle from coming through? Vehicles are a common issue when it comes to the exterior, obviously. But then again, do you want to design hedges really close to your building? You might want to, if they're the right type of hedges. We talked about holly, right? Vegetation. But they also offer cover and concealment. So you have to balance that. And that's all part of the CPTED kind of a theory. And we'll talk a little bit about CPTED in our meetings. Way back in week 3, we did policies, procedures, and processes. I think you remembered writing 2 policies. One was a security one was a silly one, just so you could understand the way that policies work and how people interpret them. Remember, the parts of the policy is the overarching explanation of what's required and basic rules. The procedure is the way the security department will implement that. And the process is how other employees implement the policy. So if you have a policy that everyone must have a ID badge and wear that ID badge, then you have to have a procedure for the security department to issue those ID badges and a procedure that they have for challenging people who don't wear one. Then you have to have a process which is perhaps signage, perhaps a policy book, something to advise employees when they need to wear that badge and when they don't. Do they wear it when they leave the grounds? Do they wear it as soon as they come on to the property, or is it when they enter buildings? Sometimes you don't want them wearing an ID out in public because you may not want it to be all that visible. You don't want your employees, you may be in a controversial business perhaps, you don't want your employees harassed because they work for the the local nuclear weapon company. So that process is how the employees will implement the policy and what you expect them to do. All 3 parts are necessary. Think of these as private laws, and it really gives you 2 things. It tells everybody what their responsibilities are, and it also ensures that leadership has endorsed it, because you get endorsements on your policies. You write them, you take them to senior leadership, especially HR, to say, this is a security policy that I find to be necessary. Here's our process, here's our procedure, and have them say, yes, I endorse this, because then when someone violates it and you take them to that leadership person who is responsible for discipline, they will already know that they have signed off on that local policy and that they will help you enforce it. We went on to talk about barriers, lights, and the purely physical side of physical security, if you will. And that's when we got into task and purpose, right? The task is, what is this thing, this device, this piece of equipment, whatever have you, this barrier, this light, what is it supposed to do? And then the purpose is, why is it doing that? What exactly do you want to get out of it? It's kind of a step thing. So for the fence, you may say you have a fence around a building, and the task of the fence is to keep people out and away from the building. The purpose is to keep them 90 feet from the building because the building contains high priority resources. It's that simple. The task of a camera is to capture images from the front door of your facility. The purpose is so that you have a record of who went and left the facility at any particular time to match up with other records should you need to prove who was in your facility at a certain time. We talked about barriers. They could be fences. They're very common, right? We're all used to those. But things like boulders, right, to direct people in a certain way, and bollards and statues and artwork, right? The big planters, vegetation itself. We talked about the holly on the walls. All those things are barriers that deter and delay, right? And then we talked about lighting a little bit. I don't expect you to know the different types of lighting. It's good to know them when you see them, because at some point you will probably be subject to them in some way. So you're trying to put video up and all you have are low pressure sodium lights, those yellow kind of ugly ones you see on the on the side of a building. They're like a wedge normally, and you see them on warehouses and industrial buildings all the time. They put off that ugly yellow light. Well, when you put up a camera, we know from this course that the greens look red and the reds look green under that light, and you really can't tell colors very well. And when you say the person was wearing a green shirt, you could be wrong. So you're going to want to change the lighting before you put cameras up, or at least just go to black and white cameras and cut to the chase. So you don't need to really know that though, because LED is the way of the future. It is inexpensive. It is environmentally more friendly. They certainly last so much longer and use so much less energy that LED is the way to go. So really, that's what your lighting really will be, whether it's provided to you or whether you're putting them up. That's really your choice. But just know that there are other types out there and have a cheat sheet somewhere. Keep your text or be able to look it up on the internet when you get to your first place of employment. But just remember, lighting it's a deterrence, right? People like darkness when they're doing something wrong. There's certainly safety benefits to lighting. So when you talk about parking lots and things like that, you talk about security also. Get the safety person involved. It's not just about getting hit over the head by an adversary in the parking lot. It's being able to see when there's ice or something that you might trip over so that you don't hurt yourself. Uh, Lighting for identification. Certainly people need to know where you are if you are an open place of business. And you're going to want to have lighting just so people can understand, what is what and where they should or should not be. And then, of course, you need lighting to support video. There are certainly cameras out there that will work in near total darkness. They actually use a process where they take the smallest amount of light they can and they wash it over everything else. But you need some sort of lighting normally for a standard video camera, and that's really why you're going to get involved in lighting, both the deterrent factor of the lighting for security purposes and to support video. We went on to talk about locks, and that was kind of our first nuts and bolts unit, if you will, right? A little less theoretical, a little more this is how things are in the field. You use predictive modeling to determine room usage. And with that, the example that I used several times during the course was the conference room in our warehouse. If you're using it as a safe room, right? If you're going to block the windows somehow or harden them with some sort of film. We didn't have time to get into good things like window film and those things in this course. There just wasn't enough time, but in a future course, maybe you'll talk about that. And there's some great window films that can be used both ballistic or just smash, right? There are some that are blast that protect you from glass flying any more than 10 feet, even in a major blast where you're 7, 8 floors up, you're going to have window breakage. But basically, you're determining the use of the room. You're predicting what the room is going to be used for before you put a lock on. So if the room's a conference room and it's just a conference room and it's open to everybody, you could use potentially a passage set or even a privacy set. I would say would probably be better, or an office set. But would you put a classroom security lock on it if you weren't going to use it for a safe room? Probably not. It'd be overkill, be expensive. Why would you do it? Why would you even worry about needing keys for that room if it's going to be accessible to everybody? The break room in our warehouse just needed a passage set, in my opinion. You could put a privacy set if you wanted to lock it at night so nobody stole the coffee or anybody's lunch out of there, I guess. But think about what the room's used for. That's your predictive modeling. There are a wide range of lock types, from the electronic to the mechanical. You're going to pick the type that matches the intended use. If you don't do that, you're going to have cost overruns and people are going to block doors. Again, if you need a key to get into the conference room every time you want to go in the conference room and people use that conference room all day, eventually someone will just block that door bolt, put a piece of tape across it so the room can't be locked, and you will have spent money on something you don't need. Important to know your task and purpose when it comes to locks. That's really what the predictive modeling is. You're picking task and purpose, just as you do with lighting, just as you do with cameras, just as you do with everything else. Understand the task and purpose, and you'll pick the right device. We went on the next week to talk about next 2 weeks actually, about access control and then access control design. An access control system for our purpose, and if you remember correctly, the definition of access control can be anything from a receptionist who says don't go in there, or a sign that says no trespassing. That can actually be access control from a pure definition. But for our course definition, we defined access control in its electronic means, and it's a system that makes a decision on allowing somebody entry or denying them entry based on permissions that you pre-program. It records a history of access by the name and time and date. Those are the two big things that you have with an electronic system. It makes a decision based on granted permissions that you've pre-identified, and it records the history of access or denial by name and time and date. It requires a reader, right? There's got to be something, and a credential. It has to have a field control panel because that's where the decisions are made locally. You need a door strike or a mag lock or some way to lock or unlock the door based on when the permission is granted or denied. There has to be power in order to run the thing because it is electric. There has to be a host that holds the software. That's where you put in those permissions, right? It's a keyboard, it's a computer, it's a laptop where you're going into a piece of software and you're just programming who can get in what door and when they can get in that door. It may require a request to exit. If there's a reader on both sides of the door, the reader itself will control, make the decision, record the activity, and open or close the door. If there's a reader just on the outside, if you only need to know when people go in, you don't need to know when they go out. And that's very common that you have a reader on one side but not the exit side. You do have to have a way to turn off the alarm, right? If the door is alarmed and you use your badge, the door unlocks, you open it up, and the alarm doesn't go off. It shunts the alarm. The alarm's turned off automatically by the system. If you're on the inside and you open that door without a request to exit device of some kind, that alarm will come back in. So you need a button or a trigger, a PIR, some type of device that will open the door when somebody comes up to it and then turn the alarm off so it doesn't report that somebody's breaking in. They're actually just leaving and they're authorized to do that. And you also have to understand that that must be tied into the fire control system, your fire system, because especially with mag locks, you can't rely on the fact that pushing that button is going to drop the power properly, especially in a fire. If some component was destroyed, the panel was destroyed perhaps, but not the battery backup, then that button, when you push it, may not unlock that mag lock. That person would require 600 or 1,200 pounds, depending on the size of the mag lock, of pressure to release that door. Most people cannot exert that type of pressure on their own. Even several people would have trouble. So you must tie into the fire system so that when the fire system goes off, it drops the power and those rooms become fail-safe. We went on to intrusion detection systems, commonly called alarm systems, but they do so much more than that because you can, once you trigger the switch can do a whole lot of stuff. There were two types. We talked about the integrated parts, which are part of your access control panel, right? The alarms get wired right back to that panel and everything works in harmony. When somebody runs a badge, the door unlocks if they're allowed to come in and the alarm is turned off so that they don't set off an alarm when they go in. When they push the Rex or they use their badge to exit, the same process happens. But if they use a crowbar to try to get in, then when they open the door, the contacts will separate. Those reed switches, remember, will separate, and it will cause an alarm to come in. So everything's integrated. There are also standalone systems. Think about those like your home alarm system, the one that the folks at ADT and other places will put in your home, and you have a little number panel. You'll see those in a lot of small retail. You walk in, you have 15 seconds to go to the panel, put in your code, and then the thing stops beeping at you. If you put in the wrong code or you don't have the code, the alarm goes to a third party. Oftentimes these things can be used in conjunction with each other so that you have something called a DMP or a Bosch panel. Those are the manufacturers that 99.9% of the panels out there go to, right? They use one or the other. And when somebody sets off an alarm, it can go back to your host so that somebody monitoring it inside your security on an integrated system will see it. And then it will also then go out to a third party like the police or another security agency. You would use that both systems in harmony. Normally when you have high value things and you are concerned, you have one security guard in the building, and if that guard goes bad, then somebody else knows it, because when he sets off the alarm or she sets off the alarm to go in and steal something, it also goes to the police or a third party security that will either dial in to see what's going on, take a look at your cameras for you, or send a patrol. These systems use switches, okay? And the switches, we talked about reed switches, but they can be any real switch at all. Anything that has an on-off, any input can be an output, right? The switches determine whether that portal or that door or that window is open or disturbed, and then tells the panel to tell you about it, okay? Passive infrared sensors, remember, they're heat activated. They are not light activated. They're not motion sensors, even though people call them motion sensors all the time. They are actually heat activated, and they detect a very small change in the heat pattern from the sides of the device from one side to the other, and thus tell your system that something is in the field of view, if you will. But it's really not motion, it's heat activated. Glass break sensors, we talked about window bugs, as we call them. Some of them are in the middle of the room. They're dual technology. It's both the sound and the vibration of glass breaking. Or you have ones that are right on the glass and they are looped together oftentimes in kind of a daisy chain. and let you know that somebody has broken a window out on the east, west, north, south side of your building, whichever you have these breaks on. Remember that IDS, intrusion detection systems, can be integrated to turn on cameras. They can be locked doors, alert the police. It's an if this, then that type scenario. So at night before I go to bed, I tell my system by voice, good night, and it turns off the lights in my house. It locks my doors. It locks my wife's car in the driveway. It turns on alarm systems. It resets my thermostat to a cooler temperature because I like it cooler while I sleep. If I make that command, good night, then it does all of those things. That's how an IDS system can work as well. If the glass is broken on the north side, I want you to call the police. I want you to notify the security. I want you to lock the front doors down. I want you to turn on cameras on that side of the building so I can see what's going on. And all of that can be pre-programmed. That's why they're just not alarm systems. They are intrusion detection. IDS systems can do a lot more. We went on for the 2 weeks post intrusion detection to talk about video surveillance systems, camera systems. I hope everybody realized that although in the beginning of the course, if I would ask people, I think almost everybody would have said that you're on camera almost everywhere. If you're not in your own house, you're on camera. And even sometimes then you might be. Who knows, right? But it's really not as thick coverage out in public as people think. Sure, if you're in a busy place like New York City and you're walking down the street and you put all the cameras that hang on buildings that belong to companies or the ones that are pointed out windows or the ones in stores, sure, you've got a very high saturation rate, but these are not connected systems. Therefore, no one person is able to watch all of those cameras. Just for your gee whiz, New York City Police Department does have a unit that they use federated video, which means that they go into businesses and request access to your exterior cameras so that they can watch streets all through Manhattan, at least. And they have pretty good coverage because a lot of companies will allow that. But most places do not have such a thing. And the coverage is not as thick as you think. So you really have to rely on your own VSS system when you have a business. The differences between VSS and CCTV. People talk about closed circuit TV. Camera systems, CCTV systems, totally different than VSS simply because a VSS system is networked. I can watch a VSS system from anywhere in the world if I have the right permissions to dial into it. A closed circuit TV is just that, closed circuit. It's on its own backbone, has its own wiring, and it terminates in one place, and it's a loop of wires that you can't get into from a network. Once you put it on a network, it becomes a VSS. But when it has its own backbone and it's a closed system, it is CCTV. These are reactive tools. No one is sitting watching every camera that you see. I asked that question when you went out and took pictures of cameras on sides of the building. Do you think anybody's watching it? And I think everybody realized that probably not. These are reactive tools. Something happens, someone goes and looks at the tape. In some cases, they may be set up with an intrusion detection or set on motion so that when something moves in front of the camera, it pops up in front of somebody so they will look at it. But even then, there are so many cameras out there, no one can watch every camera all the time. And so they are reactive tools. You match the type and position to the task and purpose. If you want to watch people coming in and out of a front door, you wouldn't necessarily put a pan-tilt zoom camera. Why? Because that camera may be looking someplace else. That's a camera that moves. It pans back and forth, it tilts up and down, and it zooms in on things. And if somebody had it and they were using their joystick to do just that, and you use a joystick to control those, and you wanted to see who came in and out of the front door, but they had it pointed across the parking lot and not at the front door, you would have the wrong type of camera to do that. It didn't match your task and purpose. The task was to watch the front door. The purpose was to be able to tell who went in and out at any particular time of day and report that back perhaps to a regulator or management. And with a PTZ, you wouldn't do it. So you match the type of camera. Just because something moves and it's more high tech and it's got more bells and whistles doesn't mean it's the right thing. The mounts. We talked a lot about camera mounts, and really they are an item that will take care of your cost of ownership. Remember, cost of ownership. If you have the wrong mount, when you mount a camera up over 20 feet on the side of a building and you bolt it to the side of a building, you needed a lift truck that you had to rent to put it up there. And that's great, except for 2 weeks later when the camera blows a circuit and somebody needs to go work on it, now you need to go rent a lift truck again. And especially in small towns, a lot of you took pictures of the cameras on the Sheets station that are up on the corners, and they're up about 15, 17, maybe 18 feet from the look of it. You would need a lift truck to safely work on that camera. And to rent a lift in Slippery Rock, I'm assuming you're probably going somewhere in Grove City. There's probably one or two of them available. And in the springtime, painters and window washers have rented those things. You're going to wait a couple weeks to get your camera fixed. So if you decided you wanted to not do that in the future, you would go with a parapet mount off the corner of the building up just a little bit higher that you could swing back and work on from the roof, and your repair guy could work on it the day it goes bad. So mounts are very important. Think about cost of ownership. And then don't forget that you're going to need some sort of recording device. If these are reactive tools, if you're not recording it, once it's happened, you've missed it, it's gone. So you're going to need a recording device. Generally speaking, in today's environment, that would be a network recorder, an NVR. Not much different than when you're streaming video. It's stored somewhere. You're kind of streaming it back. You just have your own private little streaming box that can generally hold a fair amount of video. I've got a couple of them that are 40, 50 terabytes stacked inside of memory stacked inside of a single box. They can record probably somewhere around 20, 30 cameras for up to 90 days of actual video, depending on your frame rate. But you do need somehow to record this stuff. That could be the old VCRs. It could be a DVR. Like the old TiVos that some of you may remember. It could be an NVR, which is what essentially Netflix and others are using. They're using servers, right? It's a network recording device. It's on a server, but you do need a place to record it. Remember that. Real quick, we talked about biodigital devices. I didn't go into a lot of detail on them because they're changing all the time. Biodigital devices, they provide a unique and consistent identifier. So if we have a system of readers where we're using badges, I can hand you my badge and it will work whether I'm holding it or you're holding it. But if it requires a thumbprint to get in, then I need to give you my thumb, right? I'm not really going to chop off my thumb, give it to you so you can get in the building, but I might hand you my badge. If you want a unique, consistent identifier, then you want some form of biodigital. Now, the biodigital devices can be facial recognition, hand geometry, high-speed fingerprint, thumbprint, voice, iris and retina scan. There was even one that I talked about that detected the unique odor of a human. Does it pass the smell test, right? Those things are available, but the issue is that there are privacy concerns, and there are some serious ones, especially with access control. So you may find that a big stadium or a place like Disney may use a facial recognition to look in crowds to match up with a known database of people who would do them harm. But using facial recognition for access control is still in its infancy. People have the right, especially in the European Union, they have a right by law, and in the state of California now, to just say, I'm not going to use that. And you can't tell them, well, you must if you want to work here. You have to have an alternative means. You're responsible for protecting that biodigital data. It is protected information, personally identifiable information, as we talked about. And so when you talk about biodigital devices, everybody will try to talk you into them. Don't be afraid of them. Consider them, but always ask the questions about privacy and what happens when someone says, I choose not to participate. What is your policy going to be? Because firing them is probably a non-starter. We went into one unit on budgets, and hopefully everybody said, holy cow, this stuff is expensive. You haven't seen the half of it. I just did a design on the fly yesterday for a rough order of magnitude, right? You needed to know about how much something was going to cost for a budget. I had to do 2 buildings. They were $250,000 a piece, and we did them in about a half an hour, myself and a colleague. Just roughed out where we were going to put security devices, what the task and purpose was for these things, and the approximate cost. And so you need to determine the rough order of magnitude when you're going to build a new building, because somebody's got to approve the total budget. And they're going to want to know how much you're going to spend on security. So you're going to need to know a general number, and you're going to have something to back it. You also need to understand, and well, you don't need to understand it for this course, but you will for security management. But one of the reasons is you need to separate capital expenses from operational expenses. For tax purposes, capital expenses are a much cheaper way to go. You can't, if you're going to spend $2 million on security for a new building and your company only brought in $2 million in revenue last year, It's going to look very bad on paper, like you spent every bit of your profit. You didn't have anything to share with your stakeholders and your shareholders. But if you capitalize it over 30 years, like a mortgage, right? Now you're only going to spend $20,000 or $30,000 a year on security over each one of those years. You can keep it from hitting your bottom line and making it look like your building is, or your business is not profitable. Also, from a tax perspective, you get certain tax write-offs for capitals that you don't get for operational expenses. You need to roll your budget up. Your budget is just not a standalone thing. When you give your budget for a project to somebody, they're going to weigh that against the cost of every other project. There may be a safety project to put new street lights up because people are tripping in the parking lot. That may not help you at all with your security, really, because the lights you have there are okay for what you need. And in fact, you may have some expenses having to adjust your cameras when they put the new lights in, right? But you have to roll your budget up with everybody else standing in line, and you're all drinking from the same well. So the project manager on our new building is including this with everything else. And when value engineering comes in, that could be a problem. When your costs are rolled up, even though I gave you a budget of $80,000 for the building, when we meet as a project manager, I may have to tell you that, yeah, but we decided to put a rose garden out front because the CEO really likes roses. That's going to run an additional $20,000 we didn't think about because he wants a really nice, little waterfall in there. And so everybody needs to cut their budget by 5 or 10% because of the rose garden. And you can't argue with that. It's a CEO and he likes roses. Done deal. So you may need to cut costs even when you're under your assigned budget. Remember that. Think about that before we meet. So we're at 31 minutes and 24 seconds, 25 seconds, and so I'm coming to the end here, so I'm just slightly over my promise of 30 minutes. During these meetings, the team lead will present the drawing that you have determined to be your best case scenario. I will ask each team member certain questions about the concepts and the reason for selection of certain devices. If indeed your team has decided that certain people will be specialists in certain things, the team leader will advise me of who would be best to ask that question of. However, I reserve the right to ask everybody to weigh in on just about everything. The team leader will then present the budget. I'll give alternative scenarios so you can show me that you have budget flexibility, that you've thought about it ahead of time, that what happens if my budget gets cut at the last minute? What happens if I did everything right, but in a final meeting they said, yeah, that's great, but you don't get 80, you get 75 or 70 or less. We're then going to do a design on the fly exercise. We're going to look at something that we haven't looked at thoroughly yet, and we're going to together do a design for the security of that project to see how well we can just kind of adapt to a new building or a new scenario. And then we're going to do a quick course recap, which I'll ask you just a few questions. So the questions that I'm going to ask, and I want to do this at the very end, and we'll be probably pressed right up against that hour, and I know you all have lives, as do I, and I have other meetings I need to attend, and you may as well. But I'd like to get some quick feedback just from for these questions. These meetings were a regular suggestion in student surveys. People wanted group projects. Now, I, for one, hate group projects. I will tell you that. I've never been fond of them. Maybe it's part of my personality. I like to work alone sometimes, but they can be slower, as we know, right? We talked about that in our peer review. But I want to know if the projects had value. If the projects as individuals and working as a group, if it had value. I'd like to know if your team meshed quickly. And I don't mean that, as a matter of, well, did everybody work well together? Was somebody a jerk? That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for was 1 week of working as a team in this particular exercise, because it did mimic what you would normally see in industry. I want to know if it was enough time to do it. You didn't have to be perfect at it, but in normal industry, when you design something like this, once you do your individual designs, you get together and you hash it out in one meeting, and then you present it in the next meeting. So this is what I was trying to mimic. But from a practical standpoint as students, was that enough? Should I do this again, or should I change the format? That's the great thing about teaching at Slippery Rock. I have great autonomy to design my courses the way I want to, as long as I meet the certain deliverables, and Dr. Lubinsky's been great about just giving me the leeway to do that. So should I do this format again? Did you find it to be somewhat enjoyable? Did you find it to be tedious? Did you find it to be helpful? Did you learn more or learn less? And then what should I change? I want to do that inside of 2 or 3 minutes. It's really just getting your juices flowing for our final. But we will talk about that. With that, I will see you all during the week. Looking forward to some great presentations, some great discussion, and you guys really showing off the skills you've learned over the course of the semester. Have a great week.